I wanted to offer my professional and personal reflections on a topic that has been in the news lately and has also been the subject of much consternation among scientists and policymakers and even the global public at large in recent months. And that topic is the 1.5 degrees centigrade, or about 2.7 degrees Fahrenheit, global mean temperature target set forth in the 2015 Paris Agreement. It has been decidedly a tumultuous decade since that historic global climate conference took place. We've experienced a society-altering global pandemic and rising geopolitical instability that has culminated in intensifying regional conflicts. And remarkably, in the same period, all of Earth's 10 warmest years on record have also occurred. And that's been associated with a spike in record-shattering heat waves and torrential rain events, associated flash floods, and also devastating wildfires in numerous regions, countless regions really, around the world. And heat-trapping greenhouse gas emissions from human sources, which is of course the fundamental cause of global warming in the first place, also reached their record highest levels just last year, in 2024. I realize that's a bit of a heavy introduction, but I think this is a critical moment in which to be reflecting on the broader context of where we are today and where we might be headed, and what that all means really for all of us. As a climate scientist, that's exactly what I'm hoping to offer you in this monologue today. First and foremost, I want to acknowledge that it's absolutely true that every 1/10 of a degree of warming matters. Each fraction of global warming is going to bring about a larger increase in the adverse societal and ecological impacts than the last. There's simply no doubt about it at this point in time. That statement, though, is not so much about the rate of warming itself, but a reflection of the growing recognition that the Earth system, especially the biosphere, or the living part of the Earth system, and the cryosphere, the frozen part of the Earth system, can respond non-linearly and sometimes even abruptly or irreversibly on human timescales to comparatively gradual shifts in climate. It's also a consequence of hydrological cycle intensification, which actually does scale exponentially, literally exponentially in the mathematical sense, with the level of warming. And so in that setting, we should in fact expect to see an acceleration in the intensity of certain kinds of extreme events, like flash floods or droughts or severe wildfires, so long as the underlying warming rate remains roughly steady. My colleagues and I, in fact, in a recent review paper on increasing hydroclimate volatility, used the analogy of the expanding atmospheric sponge to describe how a warming atmosphere enables rapid and accelerating increases in both extreme dry and extreme wet events at opposite ends of the spectrum, often in the very same locations at different points in time. So in this sense, each fraction of a degree of warming is quite literally worse than the last. That's what makes what we're facing over the next few decades seem quite daunting indeed. I've long been of the view, though, that the 1.5 centigrade warming target was pretty unlikely to have been successful. It was a highly ambitious target from the start, even when it was announced originally, given the climate trends we were seeing at the time and the geopolitical trajectories that were foreseeable moving forward. And I think that it's fair to say that given today's even more challenging geopolitical realities, even 2 degrees centigrade, or about 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit, of global mean warming honestly looks like a bit of a long shot in this moment. Though it does remain a geophysical possibility, so it remains physically possible to achieve a significantly less than 2C of warming target, the actual real-world geopolitical and economic plausibility of the very rapid transformation globally that would need to take place if we were going to make that possible seems rather low in this moment in particular. Now, there's certainly, don't get me wrong, certainly nothing wrong with high ambition. In fact, I actually think we could use a lot more of high ambition these days, emphasizing the critical importance of keeping warming to its lowest level possible, and also characterizing, honestly, the progressively more dire consequences of exceeding these important targets like 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade or whatever that might be, does have real value. But I also think we need to be honest about where we're likely headed, on our current path at least, unless there is some dramatic and seemingly implausible realignment, some dramatic intervention in the near term. And that's because our present trajectory is one that brings us to and well past 1.5 degrees centigrade of global mean warming in the next 5 years, continuing forward in time over the next few decades on a path toward 2.5 to 3 degrees centigrade of global mean warming by the end of the 21st century, which is now less than 75 years in the future. We haven't actually reached, by the way, 1.5 degrees centigrade yet, using the multi-year definition set forth by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, which is an important caveat, I think, to understand in this moment of divisive conversations. But it does look like we will be there sooner rather than later, and we are on track to blow right past that warming target, at least where we stand right now. So in other words, our current policy trajectory would still yield essentially a doubling of the observed warming that we've seen so far. But the consequences from that continued warming, from that further doubling, would actually far exceed a doubling of the human and ecological consequences that we've seen with historical warming to date. It is realistic, if we indulge in some optimism about global geopolitical ambition and practical evolution, that we could still keep warming from greatly exceeding 2 degrees centigrade. That's a realistic possibility if we really get our act together very quickly. But even that comparatively optimistic scenario entails a lot of additional warming beyond where we are right now. There is a real risk, though, I think, in being overly sanguine when it comes to our climate trajectory. If we fail to recognize the dangerous realities that lie ahead on the most likely path, on our current path, then we will not be adequately prepared to confront them head on. And this includes the need to engage in aggressive climate adaptation. In other words, reworking systems and societies to better cope with higher temperatures and rising sea levels and increasing extreme weather events, in addition to rapid climate mitigation, which is to say, working to solve the underlying problem of global warming in the first place. Historically, I think we've focused a little too much on mitigation, and so that in some circles we've actually lost sight of the more imminent need for adaptation in the near term, right now. And that's actively putting lives and economy at risk in this pivotal moment. So we can, and indeed we must, do both adaptation and mitigation as the climate continues to warm. It simply isn't an either-or prospect, and we can't let future climate targets distract from the present-day reality that warming is already having severe and widespread adverse societal and ecological impacts that need to be urgently addressed right now. I also think that framing any particular level of warming as a quote-unquote threshold can sometimes be misleading to a general audience, and I prefer the term target, which is in many cases the formal word used, by the way, in much of the IPCC literature, to emphasize that these are ultimately human constructs rather than well-defined or discrete geophysical cliffs that we can fall off of. Now, to be clear, there very likely are some actual geophysical cliffs out there, including so-called tipping points, which is where a system suddenly shifts from one state to another in response to a comparatively incremental push. And the most concerning ones in my mind right now are the ones that exist in the biosphere and the cryosphere. So again, the living sector of the Earth system and the frozen sector. It would be very bad, for example, if we tipped the Amazon or other key tropical rainforests into a non-forest state, a grassland or a savanna where there was once dense tropical rainforest, for example, or if the rate of sea level rise were to suddenly accelerate over the course of just a few years or a decade or two due to the collapse of polar ice sheets. Both of these are real examples. These are actual possibilities of things that could happen in the greenhouse, that is the Earth. And there are other similar potential catastrophes lurking out there in the Earth system. Indeed, as the late geochemist Wally Broecker often and infamously warned, the climate system is an angry beast, and we are poking at it with sticks. I might add that we are increasingly poking at it with a growing number of increasingly sharp sticks as the decades have passed since that statement was originally made. But the reality is we still don't know exactly how much warming would be required to trigger these more sudden dramatic shifts. It might be 2 degrees centigrade or could be 4 degrees centigrade for some of these tipping points, yet it could also be 1 degree or 1.5 degrees. And if that's the case, we may have already passed or are getting very close to passing the critical point in these systems without even knowing it yet. Scientific evidence does suggest that the risk of hitting one or more of these tipping points rises significantly between about 1.5 and 2 degrees centigrade of warming above the pre-industrial baseline, in alignment with some of the key Paris Agreement targets. This is part of the reason why these targets are sometimes talked about as thresholds. It's also one reason why I, as both an Earth system scientist and a citizen of the world, am particularly nervous about what might come to pass in the next few decades. Partly, it's that the uncertainty there is not our friend. But the reality is that we just don't know enough about the details here, except to say that the risk of reaching these critical thresholds or tipping points definitely rises with each passing fraction of a degree of warming. And I sincerely hope that we don't find out exactly where those dragons lie through collective personal experience in the decades to come. So, are we feeling lucky? Because we're playing an increasingly high-stakes game of roulette with the global climate, and the odds are decidedly not in our favor. Breaching 1.5 degrees centigrade of warming for a sustained period, as now appears likely to occur later this decade at some point in the 2020s, is an unsettling sign that we haven't yet adequately bent the carbon curve, and also an indication that the best-case scenarios from a decade or so ago are unfortunately probably off the table at this point. Yet it's also not the end of the road, and I really do want to emphasize this point, nor a sign that all hope is lost. Quite the opposite. It's very important also to keep in mind that the very worst case warming scenarios from 10 or 20 years ago are also now off the table, and that represents real progress relative to an even scarier counterfactual future that might have been, but for interventions that we've actually been successful in imposing since that time. We still know what we need to do to halt global warming. It can still be done. It will require a radical scaling up of collective global ambition, and doing so against an increasingly volatile geopolitical backdrop. We should have no illusions. This will be no easy task. And we should not forget that we must also rapidly scale up our climate adaptation capacity in the meantime and in parallel, so as not to leave the most climate-exposed individuals and societies behind. But this too can be done. Such progress is not inevitable by any means, but it is also far from impossible. So the big question is, moving forward, will we act fast enough to avoid the worst outcomes and avert the most harm as the consequences of climate change accelerate in the coming years and decades? I honestly don't think anybody can answer that question with certainty in this moment, but I sincerely hope that we're up to the challenge.